So today is, we'll get to, let me first talk about the Parsha, I'll get to today, very special day. So this week's Parsha is Parsha Bechukotai. It's a hard one to pronounce. It is the final Parsha of the book of Leviticus, which is the third book of the Torah. So at the end of this week, we are 3/5 of the way through the Torah. We're getting there, more than halfway through. And so this week's Parsha has really two parts. The first half starts off by saying, if you follow in my ways and you keep my commandments, then I will provide all sorts of wonderful things for you. Everything will be wonderful. You will overcome your enemies, and you will have food and rain and everything, and you'll be healthy, and everything will be fine. And then it says, if you do not follow me and you do not keep my commandments, then you will have famine and you will have disease and you will have war and you will be driven from the land. And it goes into a long detail of into great detail of what will happen if you do not follow my commandments. And so that is the first part of the Parsha. We've done a class in the past about the Jewish belief in reward and punishment, both physical reward and punishment, as well as spiritual or reward and punishment in the next world, in the afterlife. So then the second part of the Parsha speaks about donations to the temple. So the temple treasury essentially belongs to God, and so anyone could donate their things to the temple. You can donate a regular item to the temple. You can, if you donate a animal to the temple, then that animal, if it is an animal that can be used as a sacrifice, must then be brought as a sacrifice. If you donate, you could also donate a person's value to the temple. And the Torah says that if we donate a person's value, then gives us, based on their age and gender, gives us a set amount per person. Doesn't seem to have much rhyme or reason why particular ages and genders have particular amounts, but the Torah just says that's the amount. The Torah also says that if you donate your field in the land of Israel, where every Jew was given a field when they first came in, everyone was given a plot of land, which would then pass on from generation to generation, as we learned last week about the Jubilee year. It would then return, even if you sold it, it would go back to its original owners in the Jubilee year, so it remained in the family. So if you donate that land to the temple, then there is a standard amount based on the size of the land, the number of years left the Jubilee that you have to pay to purchase it back. And if you fail to purchase it back, then before the Jubilee, then it will be sold to somebody else, and then you lose the land from your family. Instead, it goes to the Kohanim, to the priests, get it instead. And so you lose it. And then the Torah tells us that if you do dedicate an animal to the temple, if anyone who takes something that belongs to the temple and uses it without permission must pay back and pay an extra fifth penalty. And if you do dedicate an animal to the temple, you're not allowed, as a sacrifice, then it must be brought as a sacrifice. You're not allowed to then attempt to exchange it for a different animal. That would be forbidden. So that is the Parsha in short. Today is Lag BaOmer, which is the 33rd day of the Omer. So we've mentioned a number of times already, we count the Omer from the second day of Passover until Shavuot, 49 days, and Shavuot is the 50th day. So let us begin by saying the Omer together, and then I'll tell you a little bit about Lag BaOmer. So we'll do it in Hebrew. So say it after me. Hayom, Shlosha, Ushloshim, Yom, Shehem, Arba'a, Shavuot, V'chamisha, Yamim, LaOmer. Today is 33 days, which is 4 weeks and 5 days to the Omer. So just over 2 weeks left for Shavuot. So it's the 33rd day of the Omer, which is known as Lag BaOmer. Lamed is 30 in Hebrew, because we use the letters as numbers, and Gimel is 3, so 33. Lag is 33. It's the 33rd day of the Omer. What's special about the 33rd day of the Omer? So we're told the 33rd day is a holy day, a special day. For some time, people didn't know exactly, or wasn't widely known what it was for. But there are two things that we celebrate primarily on Lag BaOmer. Firstly, according to tradition, it is the anniversary of the passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, or Bar Yochai, was a sage, one of the sages of the Mishnaic era. He's widely quoted in the Mishnah and other Mishnaic era works. The Mishnaic era is from about the year 0, a little before that, till about the year 200. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai lived in the mid 100s, and he lived in northern Israel, where most Jews lived at the time. Southern Israel was mostly desolate due to wars. And he is, according to our tradition, the primary teacher of the work that became known as the Zohar. The Zohar is the most comprehensive work, early work of Kabbalah from that period. I think we did a class on the Zohar some time ago. It's a very, very large work that follows mostly the order of the Torah written as a commentary on the Torah. It's written in Aramaic, or Western Aramaic, that they spoke in the land of Israel at the time. And while he didn't write the book himself, it's his students that wrote it, and it's mostly his teachings. And so he was a great master of Kabbalah, of mysticism. He was one of the, we could call him one of the kind of most important teachers of Kabbalah in Jewish history. And the Zohar actually describes the passing of Rabbi Shimon, and during his passing, or right before he died, he was surrounded by his students, and he asked that they make the day that he passes should be a day of celebration. So the day that he passes is Lag BaOmer, the 18th day of the month of Iyar, and it has become a great day of celebration. And it is in Israel. People go up to his grave, where he's buried on Mount Meron in northern Israel, and there's a very, very large pilgrimage to his grave. Hundreds of thousands of people usually go. Unfortunately, this year, because Israel is at war, the grave has been closed, and because they're afraid of some of Hezbollah sending rockets while there's a large crowd there. Not a safe thing. And so it's been closed, unfortunately, this year, but hopefully it will be open again in the future. But every year, usually is a great celebration there. In addition, the Talmud tells us that the teacher of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the great sage Rabbi Akiva. We once did a class on Rabbi Akiva as well. And Rabbi Akiva once did a class on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai too, I believe. And Rabbi Akiva had a yeshiva, had a school, probably one of the largest schools in Jewish history. It was a school with 24,000 students. And 1 year after Passover, they were struck by plague, and almost the entire school was wiped out in this plague. And the plague, according to tradition, lasted for 33 days. And on Lag BaOmer, they stopped dying. So because of that, we celebrate Lag BaOmer as a day kind of where they stopped dying from this plague, also in the days of Rabbi Akiva. So for these two reasons, Lag BaOmer is a day of great celebration. It's also a day to focus on Jewish mysticism. Historically, Jews would go out to the fields on Lag BaOmer, be a time where they would kind of go out and play or celebrate in the outdoors, in the fields on this festival. In many communities, they would build bonfires representing the Kabbalah, the mystical part of the Torah, which is compared to fire. There's also a custom, many would play with bows and arrows to remind us of the Roman persecution, where they would go out during times of Roman persecution, where they were forbidden from studying Torah, they would secretly study Torah in caves in the land of Israel. And when they were caught, they would pull out bows and arrows and pretend to be practicing their doing target practice. That was how that's how they managed to get away from the Romans catching them. So, and again, this happened during the time of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Akiva, and so that's so there's that custom as well on Lag BaOmer. And we will, because of that, have a great festival here for various reasons. We used to do it in parks, but now we're doing it. It's a lot safer to do it in a closed-off area, so we're doing it here, and that will be right after our class. At about 11, a little bit after our class at 11 a.m. this morning, and I encourage you all to stay for that celebration. You got your breakfast, you'll get your lunch there as well. Any questions about Lag BaOmer or the Parsha? We don't know the disease that caused the plague, but the Talmud says that they were deserving of the plague because they did not respect each other.
At 11 o'clock, what room is it going to be in?
Outdoors, the parking lot. Yes, big party. So because it is Lag BaOmer, and it's also really connected to this week's Parsha as well, the subject of today that I want to talk about is the importance of Jewish pride. So Jews have been around for thousands of years, more than 3,000 years. We have survived, we have thrived, we are still here today, despite being so few and being so persecuted. So many other nations have risen and are now gone, but we are still here. Hard to imagine. When you think of history, the nations that you have today, most of those peoples weren't around that long. Maybe a few hundred years, maybe 1,000 years. Jews have been around. There were many other groups that were around, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Jews have been around for a very, very long time, well over 3,000 years. And yet in every single generation, we say this in the Haggadah, they tried to destroy us, and yet we are still here. We had a lot of people who hated us, a lot of people who tried to destroy us, and yet we have survived. Now, there are many explanations for Jewish survival and what the secret of Jewish survival was. Of course, the most important explanation we believe is, as we say in the Haggadah, V'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu lachalotenu. In every generation they stand up against us to destroy us. V'akadosh baruch hu matzileu miyadam. And the Holy One, blessed is He, Hashem, saves us from their hands. So really, of course, the only way we survive is because Hashem saves us. Or as the Talmud puts it, we are like a sheep living among 70 wolves. And if not for having a really good shepherd, there's no way we would survive. We're only here thanks to the shepherd. So yet, I believe that there are, and we definitely can point to other important details, and there are a number of such factors that we can point to that help explain our survival in a more natural sense. A lot of very important things that we have done that have allowed us to survive, both keeping the Torah, of course, has allowed us to survive, and there's a number of other things, and we've done some other classes, we've spoken on some other factors. But I think one of the keys to our survival has been our Jewish ability to remain unique and different from everybody around us. We're able to stay unique, we're able to stay different. In the Torah, we are told Balaam was a non-Jewish individual who was hired by the Moabites to curse Israel. He was a prophet, and he attempted to curse Israel, and Hashem told him, you can only say the following words, and he gave him these great blessings. One of the blessings that he told him was, Am levadod yishkon, uvagoyim lo yitchashev. We are a nation that lives alone and does not take into account the other nations. We don't look at what the other nations say. We live alone. We stand alone. Or in King David's prayer, King David tells God, Mi ka'amcha, in the book of Samuel, Mi ka'amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. Who is like your nation Israel? We are a unique nation in the land. We stand unique. We stand apart. And we have always stood unique, always stood different, always stood separate from everybody around us. And we've always not only stood separate and unique, we've more importantly always been proud and comfortable with that uniqueness. Our sages say that when Israel, the children of Israel, were redeemed from Egypt, they were taken out of Egypt. It says they were redeemed in merit of three things. They were in Egypt for, according to our oral tradition, 210 years. And throughout that time, although they did not yet have the Torah or Judaism, they retained their Hebrew names that they had been given, and they come out of Egypt still with Hebrew names. They had retained their Hebrew language, although they were living among Egyptians that spoke Egyptian, they retained the Hebrew language, and they retained their distinct clothing. So although then they did not have Judaism as we know it, they did not have the Torah and the commandments, they still remained culturally distinct from the Egyptians. And it was only because of that that Hashem was able to take them out of Egypt. And we have continued to remain distinct and different, both when we lived in our own land in Israel, when King David spoke about it, we were distinct as a nation among the nations. And when we were in exile for much of the last 2,000 years, almost all Jews have been exiled in a large diaspora spread across the entire globe, and we remained always distinct. In the 18th century, German Jews at the time, in Germany was not a country at the time, but it was a collection of various German states. But in the 18th century, Jews in Germany and Central Europe were somewhat successful. They had done well for themselves financially. And they were living in a quickly developing society. It was just on the eve of the what would become the Industrial Revolution. But at that time, thanks to colonialism, thanks perhaps to other developments in Europe, Europe and especially Central and Western Europe was developing very, very quickly. And yet, at the time, Jews were extremely persecuted. They were forced in most states in Germany to live in ghettos. Ghettos were these walled enclaves that they had to live in within the cities. They were in many places not allowed to be found outside the ghetto during certain hours or on certain days. There were many limits as to what they could do. They generally could not go to universities. They could not serve in various professional capacities. Definitely could not serve in any government roles in virtually every state, every German state at the time. And they were heavily limited, as well as there was a lot of, they were, as well, not only were they limited, but they were also persecuted. They mistreated. They were looked down upon. Harming a Jew was considered less of a crime than harming a Christian, especially if a Christian did it. If a Jew harmed a Christian, it would be considered a much, much more severe crime. And there was really a lot of anti-Jewish bigotry in Germany. Many Jews felt that it was their differences, it was their distinction that caused non-Jews to hate them. And so in the mid-18th century in Germany, many Jews advocated that the solution to anti-Semitism and to persecution was for Jews to become more German-like. How would they become more German-like? Firstly, although Jews spoke a dialect of German, Yiddish, which was a Jewish dialect of German and somewhat similar, but they didn't speak German. And even if they knew German, it was somewhat with a Yiddish accent. Their accent sounded a little different. And so the one important factor that they believed is they should learn to speak German the way Germans do. Furthermore, Jews had a somewhat unique way of dressing in Europe at the time, and Jews should start dressing the way Germans dress as well. And even further, in general, they were going to adopt German culture. Many went so far, even in their synagogues, not that they would go to church, but that they would make the synagogues look more like churches, and perhaps even make Jewish observance look closer to what the Christians would be familiar with. So they weren't that different. They were what they called themselves Germans of Mosaic faith. And they used Germans first, and their religion happened to be Christian Germans, and there were Jewish Germans. That's the way they saw it. They weren't a different people or a distinct nation. They used the motto they used was to be a Jew at home and a German when you go out. In your home, you could be Jewish, but when you go out in public, you should act German. Unfortunately, while the first generation advocating for Jews to be more German was still very observant of Jewish law and kept Jewish law faithfully and the commandments. However, subsequent generations quickly turned to assimilation and began to drop Jewish observance as well. And within 2-3 generations, most German Jews were highly assimilated. Many of them converted to Christianity. Many of them were just Jews still, but not very observant in their Judaism. A somewhat similar thing happened here in the United States. The original Jewish immigrant population started coming around the 1840s in a difficult time in Germany, around the time that many people moved from Central Europe and from German states to the United States, when there was a huge wave from that region. Many Jews came as well. And tens of thousands of Jews came. Most of the German Jews who came to start with were highly assimilated. So though they were German speaking, but they came to the United States and they quickly assimilated into US culture. Starting in the 1880s, though, millions of Eastern European Jews arrived in the United States. They came culturally Jewish, distinctively Jewish, and many of them, most of them, came from religious homes back in what was Eastern Europe, and mostly the Russian Empire. However, many of them quickly also dropped Jewish culture, stopped speaking Yiddish, the original Jewish language, what was the Jewish language in Europe, stopped dressing distinctly, taking off their yarmulke and tzitzit perhaps, and quickly were assimilating into larger American culture. Within 2 generations, most Jews that came during this period between 1880 and 1914 were hardly distinguishable from their non-Jewish neighbors. Now, to be fair, unlike German Jewish assimilation, which was somewhat intentional, it was a movement to make Jews more German-like, the Jewish assimilation in the United States was much more organic, and is probably can be better blamed than a particular policy of Jewish leaders or Jewish thinkers. Was more an American culture at the time. We had very much a melting pot culture where we wanted all cultures to kind of become part of a larger American culture at the time, before multiculturalism became popular in this country. And it was also at the time there was a very strong lack of Jewish education, something that I've spoken about before, and that also probably led to very quick assimilation. So what we see from this kind of historical account is that the lack of public Jewish distinction and uniqueness, the lack of Jews being visibly Jewish and being publicly Jewish and being actively Jewish tends to lead to assimilation. Even if someone were to be Jewish at home, and very, very observant at home, following all of the commandments, as best as following all the commandments at home, and even when they go out, being careful to only eat kosher and observing Shabbat, and yet culturally they try to avoid anything that could show them to be Jewish. They dress in a way that doesn't make them look Jewish at all, distinctly Jewish. They never share with anyone their Jewish identity, and they keep it very, very quiet as kind of a secret. So even so, the fact that someone's not sharing it, the fact that they're not public about it, gives the sense that that's not really who you want to be and what you want to be. Because if that's really something you are happy about, why wouldn't you share it? And so children growing up with parents who are Jewish only at home but not in public are grown up giving, subconsciously, they're given this sense that they should feel uncomfortable with their Judaism because they're told to never show it publicly. It's clearly something they're supposed to be uncomfortable about. If you're uncomfortable about it, if you're uncomfortable with it, why would you keep it up? Why would you keep doing it? And so while the first generation, maybe by guilt, maybe because they believe strongly in that it's important, follow the commandments, it won't last more than a generation or two. The children and the grandchildren will be inclined to drop it at home because you're not sharing it, because it's something that you're keeping quiet. Now, not only did lack of Jewish distinction lead to assimilation very, very quickly in Germany, in other Western European countries, here in the United States, it also was ineffective in its primary goal. The original goal of Jewish German leaders and thinkers who wanted to make Jews more German-like was with the hope that if we could just be German as opposed to Jewish. Now, just to be clear, in the 18th century, when this began, Jews were not considered German. You were either German or you were Jewish. You couldn't be both. And that was true everywhere. In Russia, you were either Russian or Ukrainian or Polish or Jewish. Right? Jews were considered a distinct nation, a distinct group, a distinct ethnic group, a distinct nationality. And that was true throughout Europe. And not just in Europe, it was true in other places as well. In the Ottoman Empire, you could be Greek, you could be Armenian, you could be Turk, and you could be Jewish, and you could be Arab. But Jewish was one of the nationalities in these multi-ethnic empires. And so Jews were considered their own group. The idea of these new German thinkers was that, well, they hate us because we're different. In Germany especially, Jews, unlike, let's say, in the Russian Empire, where there were dozens of nationalities, all of whom hated Jews, just about, or in the Ottoman Empire, where also there were dozens of different nationalities, most of whom, both some Christian, some Muslim, and most of them disliked Jews. But in Germany, Jews were really the only distinct nationality other than German. And so Jews had this belief that if we aren't a distinct nationality, if we aren't a distinct group, we could be just Germans of a different religion. Because in Germany at the time, Germany was split historically between Protestants and Catholics. There were many German Protestants, many German Catholics, and that was fine. They were all German, just of different religions. Why can't you be German and Jewish as well? That was their idea. And so their goal was, the idea was to stop anti-Semitism, that they should no longer hate us because we're one of them. We're German just like them. Unfortunately, we know the history. It was highly ineffective in ending anti-Semitism. Well, it did help Jews somewhat assimilate and drop their Jewish practice. However, the anti-Semites made sure to remind them that they were still Jewish, and anti-Semitism continued in Germany throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. By the end of the 19th century, Germany, which already had now become a country, already had an official anti-Semitic party by that name. It was the anti-Semites that coined that term, anti-Semitism, in order to sound more sophisticated than just plain Jew hatred, right? So they coined the term anti-Semitism, and there was a party, both in Germany, in France, and in a number of other countries. There was a political party called the Anti-Semitic Party. People who were very proud to be part of that party because they were defined by their hatred for Jews. And that was despite Jews in Western Europe being mostly assimilated, speaking the local language, dressing like the locals, acting in all manners like the locals, and most were not even Shabbat or kosher observant. They were not distinctly really different in any way, other than they went to the synagogue instead of the church, but if they even went. And they really weren't distinctly different, and yet it didn't help ending anti-Semitism. If anything, counterintuitively, it seemed to lead to more anti-Semitism. The more Jews tried to hide their distinctiveness as Jews and tried to hide their Jewishness, the more anti-Semitism they felt. And the reason for this is simple. People who hate others, they want to show their power over others. Anti-Semitism, like every other form of bigotry, is really just a form of bullying. It's a form of showing your power over someone else. Somebody else who, by birthright, you've decided you're better than them, and therefore you have the right to put them down. You have the right to oppress them. And so it's really one person showing their power over someone else. And so what happens, we know with bullies, is that when the victim of the bully shows fear, then the bullies feel empowered. The more fear the victim shows, the more empowered the bully feels. The more the victim tries to please the bully, the more they encourage the bully. And therefore, the best way to counter bullying is to stand up to the bully, to not allow them to dictate to you what you should be doing, to not allow them to push you around. When you stand up to the bully, then they're not gaining anything. They don't want to fight. They want to control. They want power. And so the same thing is also when it comes to larger bigotries, ethnic bigotries, and religious bigotries, and when it comes to anti-Semitism. They hate us, but they want to control us. They want to have power over us. When we show fear, when we show we're afraid, and we don't publicly display our Jewishness, when we hide our Jewishness, then they're going to go and find it for us because it makes them feel powerful. They know that we're afraid to show to them that we're Jewish. When we are openly and actively Jewish and we're not afraid of them, it doesn't necessarily get rid of anti-Semitism. I'm not going to suggest that at all. Anti-Semites will always be anti-Semites, but it definitely makes them think twice, and it discourages them from attempting to show that anti-Semitism because we're going to stand upright. We're going to stand back to them. We're going to stand up to them, and they won't. They won't. Therefore, they won't be encouraged to do it again. For example, if someone shares something, says an anti-Semitic remark, happened to me not too long ago. If someone says an anti-Semitic remark, you can walk away. But if you walk away, they'll probably say it to the next Jew they meet. Or you could confront them and say, how dare you say that? You're an anti-Semite. I'm going to let everyone know that you're an anti-Semite. I'm going to take your picture right now, and I'm going to put it all over social media. When you do that, when you stand up to them, then you can be certain they are probably going to remain an anti-Semite. You won't get rid of their anti-Semitism. That's a very difficult thing to do. But they're not going to go over to the next Jew they see and make the same anti-Semitic remark because they don't want the same response. And so, the best way we counter anti-Semitism is by standing up, not by trying to hide our Judaism, which shows fear, but by standing tall and proud. And that ensures that the anti-Semites are afraid and will back down. Yes, Marla?
That's a very interesting term, anti-Semite, because Semites can also be Arabs. And so people who are now demonstrating, are they hating themselves?
That's an interesting point. Anti-Semitism, as I mentioned, was coined by 19th century anti-Semites as a sophisticated way of saying Jew hate. Jew hate sounded very low class, and they were very sophisticated, so they didn't want to do that. They coined it. It means hatred for Jews. It doesn't mean hatred for Semites. That's the way it's used. Now, Dr. Lipstadt, the president's envoy to anti-Semitism, I believe, thinks that it's a mistake to use the term because it makes it sound like something that's maybe acceptable. And it's a lot better to use a term like Jew hatred or Jewphobia, right? That would make it much clearer what it is. Yes, Hillary.
You know, when you said so I was born in England, so I'm English, but my religion is Jewish. So isn't everybody where they're born in that country? They were born in that country, but their religion is Jewish.
So our religion is not only Jewish, we are part of the Jewish people. That is our people. That is who we are. Now, in Europe, it's hard to kind of picture this because we grew up and live here in the United States. In Europe and in many other countries, your nationality, in other words, the country that you are a citizen of, is often also your ethnic identity. In other words, you're English and you live in England, right? You're Scottish and you live in Scotland. However, here in the United States, it's a little bit different. Here in the United States, people are, identify as African American, people identify as Hispanic, people identify in all sorts of different ways as Asian, people as Japanese, as Vietnamese, as people have all sorts of different identities, and they're all American citizens. And that's unique to the United States, that we were never part of a single distinct ethnic group. We were all American citizens, but part of lots and lots and lots of different groups. That's unique in the United States, also where I came from Australia and Canada. In most European countries and many other countries, people associate their nationality with their ethnic group as well. But it could be not in England today. In Europe, people still feel like that. You're not ethnically, you're not ethnically Russian. You're Jewish, right? So that's the way the Russians see it, and they still see it like that today. That might be your passport. That's your nationality. Your nationality in your passport. But I think we Jews have to recognize we are not just a religious group. We're a nation. We're an ethnic group, and that's very important. That's why you could be a Jew, secular Jew. You're not religious, but you're still Jewish.
Only because people used to say to me, I didn't know there was any Jews in England.
Yes, Esther.
We came from Egypt. We never had an Egyptian passport. We're not allowed to be recognized as Jewish. I mean,
As Egyptian, right, as citizen.
Even though we've lived there and had cemeteries there and have been there for I can remember some records up to 800 AD. In fact, my husband was able to get us to find ancestors in 1647 they immigrated.
Yeah, unfortunately, that was true in a lot of places where Jews were not even given citizenship.
And you can even say right now, the difference in how they treat Jews in Iran, there is a 20-year-old who was going to be sentenced when
Was sentenced.
He was sentenced. I mean, I should say executed, but was not. They held off, and President Raisi instead of died. And that was because he defended himself. He apparently loaned money to a Muslim, a friend. He wanted the money back. They didn't. He came at him with a knife. Yeah. Even though he defended himself. Because he's
Let's continue.
Yes, and he killed a Muslim. He is.
Unfortunately, that was true in many parts of the world. We're lucky to live in a free country. Let's continue. So perhaps the first Jew to demonstrate this was Joseph. We know the story of Joseph. When he was a young man, 17 years old, he was sold by his brothers into slavery. He was a young man in a strange land. He could have, as a slave, he could have laid low. He could have kept his beliefs that he was raised with, his monotheistic beliefs in God, to himself. He didn't need to share it. Instead, the Torah tells us he was very, very open and public about his beliefs, even living in pagan Egypt. And even though he's a slave boy, he invoked Hashem throughout his day. Whenever anyone spoke to him, whenever people asked him or thanked him for things, he always said, it's Hashem doing it. Hashem has made me successful. Hashem made this work out for me. With Hashem's help, he invoked Hashem in everything that he did, even though the Egyptians didn't recognize Hashem. They were pagans. They didn't recognize it. And when he succeeded, and he did succeed in the home where he was working, he eventually became the head slave in the household. He attributed all his successes to Hashem. And he regularly invokes Hashem in his conversations, even though everyone around him was pagan. In fact, when he's first brought before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, I hear you're a good dream interpreter. He says, oh no, it's not me. Hashem helps me interpret my dreams. Says it to Pharaoh, not afraid. Even though Pharaoh's pagan, everyone around him is pagan. Why is he sticking out? Why is he making himself different from everybody else? How are they going to treat him when he says, I don't believe what you guys believe in. I believe in a one monotheistic God. And yet even though he's at the very bottom of the social ladder in Egypt, he's very, very public about it. Very open with everyone he talks to, all the way up to Pharaoh himself. And that even once he becomes leader, he continues to attribute his successes to Hashem. Now he's in a very important position. He's the leader in Egypt. How did the Egyptians feel having a non-pagan, monotheistic, for them that would be heresy, right? How would they feel having a non-pagan leader, second to the king? And yet he was very public about it. When he meets his brothers, before they know who he is, he tells them, Ha'elokim ani yareh. I am God-fearing. I fear God, right? Referring to the monotheistic God. Very open. They believe in God too, but here they found someone that actually believes in God in Egypt. And is public about it, is not afraid to share it to people. And the Torah tells us, the Egyptians worshipped lamb, so they would not eat lamb. And yet Joseph ate lamb. He said, I'm not like you. I'm not pagan. I could eat it. And he wasn't afraid. He wasn't uncomfortable. He wasn't embarrassed. Presumably they were okay. If people of other religions ate it, they wouldn't stop him. But he was not afraid. He wasn't afraid to being different. And it was his insistence, perhaps, for who he was, for being proud, that led not to people to look down on him, but for people to look up to him, for people to respect him, for Pharaoh to respect him to the point that he made him the leader. People looked up to him for standing up, for being different, even though he was perhaps the only one in Egypt. Maybe there were others we don't know that was monotheistic at the time. He was very public about it. People respected him. He rose to the top of it. The household he was in where he was a slave. Later he was thrown into prison, but he rose to the top of the prison. Again, despite constantly invoking Hashem. And Pharaoh appoints him as leader and keeps him as leader, despite the fact that he's very public about his monotheistic beliefs. Over 1,000 years later in Jewish history, when the Jews were now living in what was the Persian Empire, Haman got permission to kill the entire Jewish nation throughout the Persian Empire and came up with the decree that we know from the Purim story, that on one day he would have all the Jews in the Persian Empire murdered. And the Jewish leader at the time in Shushan, his name was Mordechai, was trying to counter the plot, was working with Esther to come up with a plan to overcome, to counter Haman's plot. And yet he didn't lay low and out of sight. You'd think if there's a plan to destroy all Jews, best thing for Jews is to lay low and not get in anybody's way. That's not what Mordechai did. The Talmud tells us that Mordechai gathered all the children of Shushan, 24,000 children. And he gathered them all for a massive rally where they studied Torah and they prayed to Hashem. So despite being slated for annihilation, they gathered in the streets of Shushan, publicly gathered, large Jewish gathering, even though they're all supposed to be murdered shortly. And their prayers worked. Hashem responded, and Mordechai's plan was successful. Esther managed to convince the king out of the plot, and Mordechai ended up taking Haman's job. But ultimately, that standing up, standing strong and proud, even when everyone's out to get you, really worked for them. And the same is true today. When the Rebbe came to the United States, he came during World War II. He fled Europe, where he was, and he made it to the United States in June of 1941. And over there, he came to New York, which had the largest Jewish community in the world by far, more than 1.5 million Jews living in New York. But while New York was very Jewish, Jews were mostly hiding in public. Jews in the United States tried not to stand out as Jews. They tried to fit culturally into the melting pot of the United States. Although they built synagogues and built Jewish community centers and Jewish organizations, they did not want to be distinctly Jewish. They quickly changed their language from Yiddish, which they had spoken in Eastern Europe, to speak English within a generation. We were speaking a good English with a good accent. The first generation, of course, had a strong accent, but tried to learn English as best as they could. We got involved in American culture, sports, or whatever, film, and every part of American culture to become fully American as we could. None of that is necessarily bad, but there was a thing to hide your Jewishness. People did not like to walk around distinctively Jewish, looking Jewish with a yarmulke. People didn't share. It was a very private thing. Even if they were observant, they wouldn't share publicly with others they were Jewish. Often it was visible. Often they would figure it out. But it was something that Jews did not want to share. Jews tried to fit into what was then the melting pot of the United States. But the Rebbe coming here in 1941 also recognized that American freedom and the value that we share in this country for those who stand up for themselves is really allows us Jews to stand in a way that we weren't necessarily even able to in the old country. And the Rebbe therefore encouraged Jews to be proud of their Jewishness. So the Rebbe settled where his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, had lived at the time in Crown Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn. and was a fairly Jewish neighborhood, very largely Jewish, not entirely. Not that religious though at the time. Most of the Jews were not religious in Crown Heights at the time. And on Rosh Hashanah of that year, after services, there's a custom that we do the tashlich. Tashlich is a prayer that we do. I did a class on tashlich. Tashlich is a prayer that we do by a pool of water or a river. And so Brooklyn, I guess it's surrounded by water, but if you're in central Brooklyn, you got quite a distance to get to the water. And the closest water from where they were was in Prospect Park, which is the largest park in Brooklyn. And so a large group of Jews walked from the synagogue and from various other synagogues, a lot of Jews in the neighborhood, walked about the 2 miles it takes to get to Prospect Park. And the Rebbe turned to some of the other Chabad students that were walking with him, and he says, let's start singing. Singing. Who ever heard of singing as you walk down the street, right? You'll call unnecessary attention to yourselves. They're walking down a big street. It's called Eastern Parkway. It's one of the largest thoroughfares in Brooklyn. And the Rebbe encouraged them. So let's sing it. Let's sing. And they, although they were uncomfortable, a few brave students began to sing, and everyone else joined them. And they were walking down the street singing. Many Jews felt uncomfortable. Many of them walked away, not to be part of this this rowdy group that's walking down the street, making all this noise and drawing attention to themselves. Jews at the time did not want to draw attention to themselves, but the Rebbe felt it was important, and he had them sing the whole way there and the whole way back. He had them sing, and then the next year they did it again. And every year, for many years, on Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe would have them sing as they walked to the Tashlich, as they walked to Prospect Park, despite the fact that all the cars would see them and stop, or at least drive by and notice it, and people in their homes, big buildings on both sides of the street, big apartment buildings would all hear it and come out and see it. And the Rebbe was, encouraged it. It's good. You'll be publicly Jewish, singing Jewish songs in the street. It's the best thing. The Rebbe, also another organization that he started right when he arrived in the United States. There were many Jewish children that at the time were not going to Jewish schools, but were instead placed in public school. And one of the things the Rebbe advocated for very strongly throughout the years was Jewish education. We've done some classes on that in the past. And so one of the programs the Rebbe started was on Shabbat afternoon, which many Jews were Shabbat observant or partly Shabbat observant. And the Rebbe would have students from the yeshiva go around and collect kids, bring them to different synagogues, and kind of teach them about Judaism on Shabbat afternoon. And they did this weekly, every week on Shabbat afternoon. The Rebbe called it Mesilas Shabbos. And so in 1943, the Rebbe asked the students to gather all those kids that they bring together every Shabbat, to bring them. Lag BaOmer that year was on a Sunday. The Rebbe said they should bring them all to the Chabad headquarters on Eastern Parkway, and then they'll have a big rally. I mean, Jewish rallies were also unheard of at the time. The Rebbe called for a big rally, and they had a rally with hundreds of children from the various groups in the neighborhood. That Lag BaOmer. A couple years later, in 1956, Lag BaOmer again was on a Sunday, and the Rebbe called for a massive parade on Eastern Parkway. Just a couple years earlier, another group that lives in the Crown Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn are the West Indies or Caribbean groups, and they started a West Indies parade on the Labor Day weekend that still goes till today. It's a very big parade. They have hundreds of thousands of people come with floats and everything, march down this very, very largest street in Brooklyn. And so the Rebbe copied that in 1956, said we're going to close down Eastern Parkway. We're going to bring thousands and thousands of children. We'll build floats promoting various mitzvot. Not, the West Indies promotes the various countries in the Caribbean, but we'll bring various floats and we'll about different mitzvot, and we'll march down, and kids will hold placards and signs about Judaism, be a proud Jew, and we'll march down Eastern Parkway, this main thoroughfare. And they did that first year in 1956. And the Rebbe continued to do these parades for many, many years. Whenever the Lag BaOmer fell out on a Sunday, the Rebbe would have them shut down this street, which is not an easy feat to do, to get the city to do it. They would shut down the street, and they would bring tens of thousands of children to the street for this massive Jewish pride parade of celebrating Judaism, to march down the streets. And the Rebbe encouraged not just in Brooklyn to do it, but Jews should do it everywhere. Wherever you are, you should have these massive parades sharing and showing Jewish pride, promoting our being Jewish. Let Jews be proud and strong and unafraid to walk around with a yarmulke, unafraid to walk around with tzitzit hanging out, unafraid to walk around to tell everyone around you, I'm Jewish, unafraid to stand up to anyone who questions your Jewishness. In the 1970s, the Rebbe had by then encouraged his followers to go on the streets and stop people and ask them if they're Jewish and offer them a chance to do a mitzvah, for men to wear tefillin and for women to give them Shabbat candles to light. And the Rebbe encouraged his students to stop and just get people to do mitzvahs. And so some of the students in the yeshiva came up with a creative idea. Instead of just putting a table out on the streets of Manhattan, or standing there on the corner somewhere on the streets of Manhattan, they could actually rent a van or a camper, and that way they could bring people inside. And they came up with an original name for it. They said, well, it's like, you go to war, you got a tank. So they called it a mitzvah tank. And they put speakers on it with blaring music, and they showed it to the Rebbe. The Rebbe loved it. He said they should do more of it, do more of them. And these things they still do. They drive around the streets, especially in New York, with campers, large vans, blaring, with that are painted with signs about Judaism, about mitzvahs, and blaring Jewish music. And they park on the streets in Manhattan or in other places, and invite people in to do a mitzvah. And the Rebbe encouraged it. The Rebbe felt that every public display of Judaism, whenever we display Judaism publicly, it's always a positive thing. And also in the 1970s, a rabbi up in San Francisco came up with this idea: why celebrate Hanukkah just in the synagogue? Why don't we celebrate Hanukkah out in public? And he decided to go to Union Square in San Francisco. I once did a class about this, about the public menorahs. But he went to Union Square, and they built a large menorah, and they invited lots of people, and tons of people came. And they lit this big menorah. When the Rebbe heard about it, he loved it. And he encouraged everyone else to do it. He encouraged them to get a big menorah in front of the White House, and encouraged that every community in the country should build these big, giant public menorahs and have big Hanukkah celebrations, publicly celebrating Hanukkah, bringing Hanukkah out into the public square. Now, not everybody supported the Rebbe's view. Many Jews were very uncomfortable with it. Many Jews would move away when they would see Jews publicly displaying their Judaism, right? Walk away. They don't want to be near it. They don't want to be associated with it. It makes them embarrassed. It makes them uncomfortable, right? Many Jews even fought these public displays of Judaism, arguing they're illegal, separation of church and state. Of course, it's not the church displaying their Judaism, but it's fellow Jews displaying their Judaism. And many Jews worked very hard to discourage it. They felt very uncomfortable about it. It's going to bring anti-Semitism. It's going to make people dislike us. Thankfully, what's happened, and I think we could partially attribute it to the Rebbe's very, very strong campaign that we should display Judaism very publicly here in the United States. Thankfully, Judaism over the years has become a major American religion, along with Protestantism and Catholicism, perhaps Islam. But Judaism is now a major American religion, widely respected, widely celebrated by public officials. Public officials all over celebrate Jewish holidays, send out greetings for Jewish occasions, for Jewish dates, and it's being Jewish is no longer something to be embarrassed about. It's something that we can be very, very strong and proud of. So in recent months, unfortunately, we have seen, recent years, but particularly in recent months, we have seen this very, very large increasing anti-Semitism in this country. And it's coming in many, many different forms, whether outright anti-Semitism or it's pretended to be pretending to be anti-Israel, but it's really anti-Semitism. And we're seeing anti-Semitism in many, many different forms. While most Jews had not experienced anti-Semitism until recently, many, many Jews who have, including myself, I had never experienced anti-Semitism in my life until fairly recently, and now it seems to be just a regular thing. And I don't think these anti-Semites were ever gone. I think they were always anti-Semitic, but they were uncomfortable sharing it. Unfortunately, now they're more comfortable, and now's not the time to discuss why that might be. But the answer, we cannot get rid of anti-Semitism as much as we try. I don't believe there's a way to get rid of it. It will always be around. People will always be, humans will always have, human faults, and anti-Semitism seems to be one of them. So I don't think we could get rid of it. I don't think there's an easy way to get rid of it. We do have to counter it, but one of the most important ways to counter it is by being proudly Jewish. People told me that they've taken off their mezuzahs in recent times because they're afraid, legitimately afraid. You can understand why. I told them, firstly, Jews now, unfortunately, we're seeing anti-Semitism, but we're in a much better place. We're a lot safer than we were throughout much of our history. If your grandparents in Egypt or in Syria or in Russia or in wherever else they may have lived could put up mezuzahs, and they were not afraid when they could have easily been hurt for it, you definitely should not be afraid. But even more so, taking down your mezuzah, when your neighbor knows that you took down your mezuzah, that they know that it's because you're afraid of anti-Semites, that's a reason for them to come after you, because they know you're afraid and they know they could bully you. And so it's important that we stand up by showing strong Jewish pride, showing who we are, not being afraid to publicly display our Jewishness. And the Rebbe felt that Lag BaOmer, which is a day of great celebration, which Jews would celebrate historically, is a great day to share that great Jewish pride, which is why he made parades on this day. And so I encourage all of you, if you're not publicly Jewish, try it. I know a few people in the community have told me that they've at least tried the week with a kippah challenge, or 30 days with a kippah challenge. Walk around wearing a yarmulke. See what they'll tell you. See what will happen, right? Try to publicly display your Jewishness. See what will happen. Firstly, the good news is that most non-Jews living around us love Jews. Most people are not anti-Semites. And this is probably true throughout history, even when we lived in very anti-Semitic places. At least, maybe it wasn't a majority, but there was always a significant percentage of people who liked us, who did not hate Jews. Most people, the vast, vast majority of people, your neighbors, people around us, love Jews. Polls show that. Jews are the most popular group in this country. They like us. There's a small percentage that don't like us. You'll hear a lot more positive than negative. And for those that might say something negative, stand up to them and say, I don't take that. That's unacceptable. You're a bigot. And today, with your phone and social media, you can even threaten them. Say, I'm going to take your picture and post exactly what you just said to me on social media and make sure everyone identifies you and your employer finds out who you are. And your neighbors find out who you are. And guaranteed, they won't do it again.
When I came to live here, I couldn't believe how there was no anti-Semitic people, because I lived with them all my life.
In England, there's been a lot more anti-Semitism. That's probably true. I think in Europe.
When I was growing up in the 50s.
I think in Europe in general, there's been more anti-Semitism. But yes, it's unfortunate that we have to deal with it. Yes.
I did.
Yes, Susan.
So like what you're seeing right now is all these kids on college campuses, and it's ridiculous. They're afraid.
What do they do?
And I think to myself, they should be doing the opposite of that. They should be standing up and saying, I'm proud to be Jewish. What's your problem?
And that's very important, that the Jewish kids on college campuses. And it's easier to just sink into the shadows and say, I don't want to be bothered. I don't want to be harmed. I don't want anyone to know who I am. Let me, just ignore it and just, do do my thing, go to classes and take my exams. That's the easier thing to do, but it's the wrong thing to do because they're going to keep coming after you and they're going to keep coming after other Jews until we stand up for ourselves. You're absolutely right. So let me just finish off. Thank you again to those. Thank you again to Alex for sponsoring our breakfast. And we will, please stick around. In 30 minutes, we're going to start a festival outside. We will next week be back and we will talk about is Judaism tribal or tribalism within Judaism, the Jewish tribe. And also I want to mention that given that it's also Memorial Day weekend, which maybe I should have mentioned, we recognize the sacrifice of the many who helped us, and many Jews included, tens of thousands of Jews who sacrificed their lives to keep us free. But here in this town, at least, there's a big festival every year on Memorial Day weekend. So we have a JCC booth out in Fiesta Hermosa, and we could still use some more. It's right there, and we could still use some more volunteers. So if anyone's able to volunteer either today or tomorrow, please let me know. We could use anyone who's able to help out. It's our chance to meet the community. We've met so many people there, and I know some of you we met there for the first time. And so if you're able to help out, please let us know.
Do you know where the booth's going to be? Because I'm coming to Monday to work.
Yes.